Good morning. Thank you for the welcome. I'm Alon, and I already have a quick slide malfunction, so that we're off to a good start. Let's cover the agenda. We'll start with a few words of introduction. Then I'll go through the three stories from World War II, no shocker there. And finally, we'll wrap up, think about the conclusion, the takeaways, and answer some questions. So, without further ado, let's do it. So, I'm Alon. I'm a data scientist at Spotify. I have to say that I don't represent Spotify. It's a Sunday, it's not a work day, so I'm only here talking about nerdy things on behalf of myself and of my employer. I'm a decimal scientist by education, which is an economist. I moved to the UK about a little bit over 5 years now, with a humble mission of feeding the nation. So I joined Deliveroo. And about 3 years ago, I moved to Spotify with an even humbler goal of just making people happy. I am also a humble Salopian, and if you don't know what that is, it means that I live in Shrewsbury. And often I can't be bothered to tell people where exactly Shrewsbury is, what's the Midlands and so on, so I just say the outskirts of London. I get away with it. Now, if you don't quite know anything about Shrewsbury, I compiled a list of a few fun facts about Shrewsbury. It is the birthplace of Charles Darwin. Any questions? I am only having a bit of a tease. Shrewsbury has been very good to me. We moved there during the pandemic after the first lockdown. It's been a lifesaver. We're there still so long because it's just comfortable, it's nice, it's great. And so I also print my own Shrewsbury swag, so come see me at the break if you want a laptop sticker. I was actually here 5 years ago, about a month after coming off the boat and moving to the UK. I gave a talk about getting an edge with network analysis in Python. Obviously, I need to kind of plug my own stuff there for the views and clicks and all of that. But there's a reason why I'm showing you that. Because, this is me now. This is me a couple of weeks ago. Some stuff happened in between. I have a lot of gray hairs, a lot of white hairs, and probably a few less hairs. So the point here is not to humble brag about myself. It's to say I'm dealing with imposter syndrome, and I felt like an imposter when I was giving a session 5 years ago. You would think that being invited to give the keynote means that I will feel like there's finally some recognition, there's some external validity that I'm not an imposter. But for me, it just says, oh, I'm even a bigger imposter. So what you are getting today is a person that is slightly better than the person that was here 5 years ago, slightly better, slightly wiser, slightly more experienced. And yeah, I hope you like what I have to offer today. So, going back to the agenda, hello, we've covered that. We have the three stories and we have the Q&A and takeaways. But before we dive in, I'd like to address the elephant in the room. And the elephant in the room is that it's Sunday, it's barely past 9 a.m., summer just officially ended. Why are we going to talk about the lovely topic of World War II? So, let's take a quick detour. Let's talk about the Florida man. I'm going to share a few snapshots from the media. I'm not going to narrate them. I'll give you a few seconds to read each, and then I'll tell you why I'm sharing Florida man stories. That's a favorite. Inspirational. happens every day. Just a couple more. And finally, one from just a couple of weeks ago. Sure. So we had a bit of a laugh, but like, why am I talking about or showing you media snippets from about the Florida man? Well, there is a lesson here, right? When we think about the Florida man, there are reasons why these stories are so common. First of all, Florida is very advanced in freedom of information laws. So the information is there, it's available for the public and for the media to pick up on it. So it's there because there's an institutionalized legal reason for it to be there, because Florida is more advanced than most other states. And so the information is available. It's also the third largest state, so there are a lot of stories. It's hot, and we know that when it's hot, people get loopy, and when it's hot, people are outside, and if you're outside, you're much more likely to get into trouble than if you're inside. And sadly, there is also a problem with mental health help and public funding. All of that also creates a vicious cycle or a Matthew effect. Matthew effect is general, just basically the rich get richer. So just because it's easy to obtain and people like it, then the media just produces more of it because people like to consume it. So there are a few lessons here. And the first one is always question your data. Why are you seeing so many Florida man stories compared to any of the other states, for example, or any other countries around the world? You need to understand the data generating process. Again, there's a vicious cycle. There's a reason why the stories are more prevalent. You need to be kind of cognizant of all sorts of biases. We'll cover some more later, but in this example, the availability bias. And like I just mentioned, could there be a self-reinforcing effect? And a life pro tip, just because a man doesn't have any arms, doesn't mean they can't stab you. If you'd like to know more, here are a few links. Everything will be available on GitHub later or probably tomorrow. I have a QR code at the end, so don't worry about like taking pictures and whatnot. It's all going to be very much available. So let's actually talk about World War II. And we'll start with the first story of the Norden bombsight. A quick history lesson. The first flight of a powered aircraft was in 1903, December, Kitty Hawk, the Wright brothers. And 8 years later, people figured out that they can use this brand new invention to do what people do best, kill other people, because they're different from us. So that escalated quickly, right? Only 8 years in between, and then a few years later, World War I broke. And over the span of 4 years, more than 200,000 aircraft were produced, about 1/3 of them by France, by the way. And the aircraft and jets really, if you can call it jets, but aircraft really evolved very rapidly because they were just churning them out, newer version all the time. So those, even though, okay, they became prevalent, they became big, they became widespread, those planes had a tiny problem. They were very, very bad at hitting the target. And this was made apparent in the PD River incident. Part of the reason here, I'm not gonna lie, I'm a toddler, I like the name PD River. Once you get the PD in the river, you can take it out and all that. So they had a bridge, and the Air Force, the US Department of War, was offered to use that bridge as target practice. And so they had a squadron of bombers that worked for 5 days in perfect weather, flying 20 missions a day, and they couldn't get it. They hit it, they didn't destroy it, they needed to actually have explosive to completely get rid of the bridge, which a few weeks later came to the realization that we need to find a way to bomb things more efficiently and more accurately. We need a bombsight. And this is kind of a quick chronological timeline of where we are. But interestingly, they found a man that is the right person to build a bombsight. This was Norden. He's a Dutch engineer. He was educated in Zurich, so he knows how to build nice stuff. And interestingly, he was working on bombsights for the Navy since 1920. So he was the right man for the job 7 years earlier. Quite a visionary. And he produced the first prototype in 1923. The first unit, the actual unit, was produced in 1927. And over the war, they planned to build 800 bombsights a month. But when Pearl Harbor happened in 1941, they ramped up production to about 2,000 sites a month in 1943. So this is what it was. It was made of 2,000 carefully crafted pieces that weighed about 50 pounds. It was essentially an analog computer. It was magnificent. It took the altitude of the plane, the speed, the wind speed, and the coordinates of the target, and it would churn out like where and when to drop the bomb. So it wasn't easy to handle. It was kind of like Git. You don't really understand how it works. You just kind of figure out how to work with it. And during the war, they trained 50,000 bombardiers for months at a time to operate those. And it was good. The bomb sight was very good. The myth was that they can hit a pickle barrel from 20,000 feet, up in the air. And when they were being kind of especially creative, they said we can actually hit the exact pickle that you choose. And it was more or less right. And so the US military spent a ridiculous amount of money. So $1.5 billion in 1940s money, which is 32 billion in today's money. It was only second to the Manhattan Project. And it was about half the budget of the Manhattan Project. Somehow I don't think that we'll see like a blockbuster about the Norden bombsight, but time will tell. And they bought a lot of them. They bought 90,000 units at about $300,000 in today's money. So, going back to those bombardiers, it was such a carefully kept secret. People believe that this thing will win the war. So the bombardiers in training needed to take an oath that if they fall captive, they will not divulge any information about the bombsight. Allegedly, they weren't allowed to take any notes, so they needed to memorize everything, but some people say it was a myth. No photos were allowed of the bombsight, but here's one, so I guess it wasn't that secret. And they actually built in an incendiary device so that if the plane crashes, it was set to kind of detonate and obliterate the bomb site so it doesn't fall into enemy hands. It was a marvelous piece of engineering that had one small problem. It didn't work. There were a few cases, but they dropped 85,000 bombs on a large German target. Only 10% of them fell in the right place. And on another occasion, 108 bombers dropped 648 bombs, and only 2 hit the target. So what happened? It didn't work-ish. So it was indeed a marvelous piece of engineering. It worked perfectly at low speeds and low altitude. It also required visual contact. And, oh, spoiler alert. Sorry about that. Guess what? If you're in a war in the European theater and you fly at low speeds or at low altitudes, you get shot down. Also, shocker, Europe has clouds. So you can't really count on visual contact. And that's the story of the Norden bombsight. It was a lot of effort. It was the second most expensive project of the war. It was revered, but it didn't work. And interestingly, there was one mission where it was used that everybody knows about. It's dropping the bomb on Hiroshima, right? It was loaded on the famous Enola Gay. It was used to drop the first atom bomb in 1945. It missed. But guess what? When you drop an atom bomb, it doesn't matter. And so the lessons here are I'll bunch these three into one. Don't fall in love with the tool. You need to get things, it's better to get things approximately right than precisely wrong. And something that works is better than something that's fancy. So as a data scientist, years ago, I was that person that wanted to work on the latest things, they use the latest library, do the most recent thing that became public. And I still want to do it now because I'm a huge nerd. But I've also learned that it's better to do something that brings value rather than just do something that's cool. And I've interviewed, many people, and there is one clear trend. Junior people like to talk about the methodology, experienced people like to talk about the impact. So that's one-ish, broken into three. Think about escalation of commitment or sunk cost fallacy. Just because you spent $1 billion or $1.5 billion on a tool doesn't mean that you need to keep investing in it. Excuse me. And sometimes, and please only do it in war context, you have to brute force it. If you'd like to know more, again, I have some great resources. I was heavily inspired by Malcolm Gladwell, and I also recommend that video on the right that tells a bit of a different story about the Norden bombsight. So that was the first one. Thank you for listening along. Let's hop on to the second one about survival bias. About a year ago, I was sat in a plane, and the guy next to me was wearing this T-shirt. He was doing the Power Man in Switzerland, which is, an interesting day. You started with 10 kilometers of running, 150 kilometers of cycling, and then, just to wrap things up, another 30K of running. And he has that little shirt there that says, "I survived." He was very gracious when I asked him if I could take his picture, but when I asked him about what T-shirt did the people who didn't survive get, he put his headphones on, and that was the end of it. So, going back to World War II, more or less, the US had about 2,000 planes in the war. About 40% of them were lost. And they needed from being downed. So they looked at all of the planes that came back, and they surveyed them for bullet holes, and found out that if you look at this standardized way of different different aircraft had different shapes, so the planes have, they weigh. And they have, and that is made of the plane itself, the crew, the payload, bombs, and the fuel. Now, if you are adding armor to the plane, it becomes heavier. And if it becomes heavier, then it also consumes more fuel. If if it consumes more fuel, then it's going to be either slower, or you couldn't fly for that long or that far. And so there's a problem. How much armor and where subject to the fuel constraints? So they did that. They had that problem, and they assembled a dream team of nerds. There was a statistical research group. It was declassified only long after the war. It was 18 brilliant scientists in Columbia University that worked on military problems in World War II. And this guy, Abraham Wald, he was part of them. He was one of those, nerd superstars, and he realized that there is a flaw in the rationale of the Air Force. He said that there is a problem of survival bias, right? This is a very common, very famous picture now, because they only surveyed the planes that survived. They didn't survey the 40%, they only surveyed the 60% that survived, not the 40% that didn't. And so if you take that into consideration, actually the trend reverses. Not only, like, the engine is not the least likely to be hit, it's the most likely to be hit, and so on. He created a model that shows that very nicely. And this work hasn't been declassified until the 1980s. It is hard to say exactly how many planes, how many lives that revelation saved, because you don't have the counterfactual. You can't really send a lot of planes without armor and with armor and compare them and see what happened. So let's very modestly assume that it happened, and in recent years, there's been a lot of advancements in counterfactual thinking and causal analysis. There's probably something that can be done if the original data will become available. A couple of other anecdotes. Abraham Wald made a simplifying assumption that the probability of being hit again is independent of how many times the plane was already hit, which I would say is a very, very strong assumption, because if you hit 11 times, I'm going to say that it's very likely you're going to be hit a 12th time. And, you just ran with it, and it worked, okay? So that's going to be a lesson there, finally, when we get to the takeaways in a bit. And then just the final thing is, and this is something I learned very recently, does anybody know what happened to Abraham Wald? He died in a plane crash. He was survived by his son, who was a brilliant theoretical physicist. So let's look at a few modern-day examples. Bill Gates is worth north of $100 billion. Zuckerberg is north of 60. And what they have in common is that they both dropped out from Harvard. So the conclusion here, if you want to be a billionaire, you should get into Harvard and then drop out. Again, it's a survival bias, because we are not thinking about all the people that dropped out of Harvard and didn't become billionaires. So I managed to pull some rough numbers. There's about 6,000 to 7,000 new enrollments every year. They say that the graduation rate is 97, 98%. So about 120 to 210 students drop out every year from Harvard, and you haven't heard about them at all. I don't want to get into politics, but there's a lot of talk about, we have old politicians, especially in the US, if you're following the news there. Again, I don't want to get into politics, but I'm going to make a suggestion of kind of maybe looking at things a bit differently. Joe Biden, He's 80 years old. People say, oh, if he's going to run again, and then he's going to become president for the second term, he's going to be 84, 85 when he leaves office. He's too old. And what I'm saying is, well, is he old now when we are considering how many other people who had a similar life trajectory but didn't come to become president? And what if we do that? All of these icons, by the way, are of male presidents, and it is only because this is really pushing my artistic skills. So that's the only reason I do apologize. But think about this, okay? Joe Biden started off as a council member in Newcastle County Council in Delaware, all right? Probably there are tens of thousands of council members across the US and probably in the hundreds of thousands since. He was a senator for 36 years, excuse me. Many hundreds or even thousands of senators were serving at the same time that he had been, and he's done it for 36 years, so a lot of people were senators while he was senator. He was vice president for 8 years, and then he became president. And a pop quiz question for the audience, how many people served as vice president and became president with a gap in between, so not immediately after? Does anyone know? One. Richard Nixon, and obviously Joe Biden. Nixon was VP between 1953 and 61, and he was president 1969 to 74. One other thing about, like another trivia thing, is that Biden is also a winner of the Presidential Medal of Freedom. And another question for you is, how many people that won the Presidential Medal of Freedom became president after winning it? One, Joe Biden. And so what I'm trying to say here is that there are a whole lot of other people that you're not considering when you're considering the age of Joe Biden. Why wouldn't we want someone who survived all of that and had all of that experience over the years at the most important position in a country? So hopefully it's some food for thought. And one last thing about Joe Biden is that he was actually a lifeguard and survived to tell about it. And on the right, you can see Ronald Reagan, because I couldn't find a picture of Biden being a lifeguard. But you know, it's black and white, it's fine. So that's one. Another thing, another shameless plug for myself. Here's another talk I gave. It's about choosing the right metrics. I'm talking about the Net Promoter Score. If you don't know what it is, you're lucky. But it's also prone to survey bias and all sorts of other biases, and I feel very strongly about that. So happy to talk about it later on in the break. And this is my personal favorite. There is the high-rise syndrome in cats. Apparently, 90% of cats that drop from 6 or more stories survived, which is quite amazing. So if you're a cat falling from a building, you want to head up to the 6th floor at the very least before you do that. And the way this paper was published and the whole thing happened is because those researchers studied data from veterinary clinics, and they survived all the cats. They surveyed, all the cats that came after a big fall and looked at how many of them actually got better and lived to tell the story, or per the story. And they found that it's 90%, which is absolutely brilliant. But of course, they weren't counting all of those cats that fell and died on the spot, which I'm going to guess is quite a lot. And this is my obligatory stable diffusion picture of a cat with a parachute from the tail. But it was a real study, and they kind of speculated about cat terminal velocity and all sorts of stuff that seem scientific but aren't actually scientific. So this was published, which is amazing. So, having done all of that, and I'm sorry to any cat people I may have offended, let's talk about the takeaways. Always consider the data you don't have. What don't you have, and what should you get? If world could make very strong assumptions to simplify things, you can too. It's everywhere, look for it, so cats, presidents, NPS surveys, and so on. And don't do that on a flight. I flew in yesterday. I had to be abroad for a bit, so yeah, that's just a life pro tip for you. Finally, our third story for the day is about the Flaw of Averages. Just to kind of give you a pointer of where we are technically 1950, but I'm going to use a very secret data scientist trick, and I'm going to say it's approximately World War II. And the story goes back to roughly 1926, so it's World War II if we do a weighted average. So that's the final story, and we talked about this amazing killing machine that was produced in the hundreds of thousands that had two small problems. The bombs didn't really hit the target, and the planes didn't survive. So what can we do about it? Let's build a better cockpit, because the planes are amazing. It must be the pilot's problem. And so that's the 1926 link I was talking about. That was when the last big design change for cockpits was made. So it's time for refresh, right? Aviation changed drastically. More knowledge or a different type of pilots emerged. And so let's study the pilots that we have now and see what happens if we can build a better cockpit, something that would serve them better, have them, have all the levers and everything handy. Spoiler alert, you've seen me talk about World War II. Gave you two stories, didn't work. This approach is not going to work either. So we, the Air Force wanted to design a good, like a better cockpit. They said, okay, let's find what the average pilot looks like and build it around that average. And they found exactly the right person for the job, Lieutenant Gilbert Daniels. He was tasked with the job, and he was the right person because he studied hands at Harvard. So he didn't go out, he didn't drop out from Harvard to become a billionaire. No, he stayed in and he studied hands. And yeah, so really the perfect guy for the job. And he studied a lot of pilots, over 4,000 in 14 Army bases. They intended to survey even more, but the Korean War broke and they just, the pilots weren't there to be studied. You can see all sorts of nice tidbits from the actual paper in screenshots over here. And so it was massive. And what do you do in a massive study? They studied 132 different bodily measures that 35 of them didn't even have names. And they were broken into 6 categories that you can see over here. I'll cover a few in a tick. You have the knuckle height, because that matters. The shoulder length, the distance between the nasal root to the wall, because you need to measure that. The nose protrusion, lip to lip distance, very, very important when you design cockpits. The knee circumference while sitting. And it was a lot. It was a whole lot. So 132 measures per pilot, 4,000 pilots. How do you do it? You do what any good researcher does. You get students to do it for you. So there was a team of 12 students on a break from between academic years, and they were split into groups of 2 over the 6 categories. So every pair was kind of doing one of those 6 categories. And the reason there were 2 is to fight fatigue. So every 2 hours, they would alternate between measuring and recording the results. So because that would, keep things fresh, and people and the students won't be prone to mistakes. And they managed to do that at a rate of about 100 to 120 pilots a day, which is a lot of pilots per day, but it takes a lot of days if you want to get to 4,000, right? And because it was a lot, they also needed to kind of create new tools and new procedures. So there were all sorts of kind of nifty devices here. And they also, sorry, where am I? Sorry about that. They also actually build like a production line for pilots. So pilots would get in, get measured, go out to the next station, do all the 6 stations, take a picture, and they're gone. Production line for measuring pilots, which is quite remarkable. It was published in a paper. Eventually, it was declassified sometime after. It took 142 pages with all the 132 measures. They tabulated, they calculated the data, and they painstakingly found the measurements of the average pilot. And cool, the hard part is done, right? We measured, we calculated, and all of that. Let's see how well we did. So of the 4,000 pilots that they measured, how many of them were actually average? 0. What if you do what data scientists like to do? You do dimensionality reduction to just 10 measures. Guess what? What if you become really, really lenient? You add buffers, 50% plus, 50% minus around the average. How many pilots do you have then that fit the average body size? 0. Good news, if you do some more dimensionality reduction, use only 3 measures, I'm gonna guess that the knuckle height was dropped. 3.5% of pilots fall into that bucket. Great success. So Lieutenant Daniels finally, understood and published that it's impossible to find the average man because, that's just the way we were built. You can have, long hands and shorter legs, and nobody will actually fit that definition of average. So they needed to change the way they're thinking. Instead of building a cockpit around the average pilot, they needed to make a cockpit that would be easily customizable to fit different pilots. Some great reading, again, is shown here. And I wanted to give you the TLDR. This picture was taken by myself a couple of weeks ago in Amsterdam in the Rembrandt Museum. So this is a way for me to humble brag that I have a passport. And I go to museums, so yeah, lots of virtue signaling here. But if you think about kind of the left-hand side, about 50% of the population, more or less, is male, 50% more or less is female. And so the average person is kind of looking like the person on the right? How many people like that have you seen recently? So that's like the TLDR, right? Yes, you can calculate an average, but what does that even mean? The takeaways for the Flaw of Averages: look for archetypes or the modes, don't look for things that are exactly average. Poke holes, question the assignment and approach, brainstorm with peers. Just because something has been done before doesn't mean that you need to do it again, bigger and better. don't gather data for the sake of gathering data, coming back to that kind of notion of, being fancy versus being practical. Be practical. Do you really need to measure all of those things, lip distance and so on, and beware of the curse of dimensionality? Simple, again, is better than complex. And it's painful. If it's painful for you to write and assemble, it's going to be painful for someone to read. So that could be kind of a telltale sign that something may be off. And share your failures. It's great that Daniel's shared that, we were wrong. We did all of this work and it was for nothing. So that's important because we don't always share or often share our failures. When possible, get students to do the hard work for you. I mentored a few students over at Spotify, and none of them accepted my LinkedIn connection request. The inspirational message for the day: you're not average. So let's conclude. Simple is better than complex. Approximately right is better than precisely wrong. Look for the data you don't have. Watch out for different fallacies and biases. Poke holes, because 50 years from now, 100 years from now, someone is going to review the data we have today, the body of work, and they say, oh, they were so foolish back then. And most importantly, if there's one thing you can take away from this today, do not trust people in Florida that have no arms. Thank you.
Thank you, Alon. That was great. I thoroughly enjoyed that. Do we have any questions that anybody would like to ask?
Thank you very much. That was very enjoyable. You said that Gilbert Daniels' project was a failure, but it didn't come up with the perfect average cockpit, but it produced an understanding that seems to be much more valuable, that there is no such thing as an average human being, and that it's still valuable enough for us to be talking about it 60 or 70 years later. So, where do you see that as really as a failure, or as something that was an advancement of our understanding?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's, I guess, a matter of personal opinion and about how you present things. Because one could argue that what you see often is take drugs, for example, right? We find drugs that do things that they weren't supposed to do, right? So the latest craze with diabetes medicine that helps people lose weight. Viagra was for heart disease, I think. And when I was in uni, we had a case study where a company developed a miraculous headache medicine that was very good at taking away the headache by killing people. And so if we just look at the first two, the story there is, oh, we wanted to do this thing, but we found out that thing. And he didn't do that. He said, we did this thing. We spent 142 grueling pages saying, we did all of that. Look at what we've done. And then, a footnote of actually. And so my guess is, or my point of view, and it's just one person with an opinion, is that he could have spun it differently, but he didn't, and that's I respect that.
Thank you for all.
Any softball questions, please?
I think mine's pretty soft. Do you know if that data set is available? If Gilbert's data set is available?
Couldn't find it. The paper was, it was declassified, but I couldn't find the underlying data. Someone. Yeah.
Do you know when they were designing the adjustable cockpit afterwards, whether the data that Gilbert had measured fed into that design process?
I'm going to assume yes, because it's easy for me to say. But I think that there was a kind of change of paradigm, because initially manufacturers said, oh, that's impossible. It's going to be very, very hard to, customize the cockpit and so on. You must be wrong. And then when the US Air Force said, well, we're not going to buy any more planes, they took those kind of insights and miraculously found easier ways, non-expensive ways to customize the cockpit. So I'm not sure, I don't actually know, but my guess is that in the link between the two things, they did take those measurements into account.
Hi, I'd seen the survivorship bias picture before, but what I haven't seen was the numbers about how you decide which parts that never received any hits you would proactively enforce more than others. So you have those numbers about, if you get hit with the engine, that's way more likely to take you down than hit the middle of the tail. I was wondering how you can get those numbers if you don't have the data like we see, that picture we see.
Great question. It's hard. It's a problem, just talking about my everyday work, which I don't, it's not my everyday work, but every now and then, I need to see what do people that don't use Spotify do, right? Which is very, very hard to get that data. Going back to your original question, interestingly, the paper is very theoretical. I just built a model and did some fancy hand waving and managed to sell the idea. Nowadays, I guess I would say what I would do if I wanted to leverage that original approach in the paper. I would just write a Python simulation and throw in a bunch of assumptions and see what happens if we simulate it for 10,000 times or 100,000 times. Keep in mind that like I said, I'm mildly or just barely competent enough to be on this stage, so don't take my word for it.
Any other questions in the room?
Hi, I have a question about the Norden Bombsight. So, it was the second most expensive project that they did for World War II, and they spent so much money on it. How did they get it so wrong?
Well, I wasn't there, and there are. So I mentioned this is going to be a while before I get there. Cats. My guess is escalation of commitment. It did work under perfect conditions, and then it was oh, I know what the slide I was looking for, sorry. If you check out the video on the right, there's this whole story about it was actually not that big of a secret, and the bombardiers didn't need to memorize everything, and so on. My guess is escalation of commitments. I saw it working well in ideal conditions, and they were happy. And war is chaos, so they we have this thing that kind of works. So that happened. The guy on the right, Flight Dojo on YouTube, tells a different story, that it was mostly kind of salesmanship. And yeah, your guess is as good as mine. I would say one interesting fact about the Norden Bombsight is that it actually wasn't that much of a secret, because Norden was a Dutch and he worked in Switzerland a lot, and he actually gave his plans to some German counterparts like in the 30s because he thought, look at this cool thing I built. Yeah, so I don't know.
Do you know what a bombsight, how do they do a bombsight actually works?
Math. Yeah, sorry, the closest I've got to a jet was like, well, you know, every now and again you have those air shows where you take little kids and put them on a plane, they're happy. So that was the peak of my career when it comes to flying stuff. Sorry.
That's great. And we do probably have time for one last question. Anybody have any questions they wanted to ask? No, brilliant. Yeah. No, that was really great. And I think you've given us all lots of wormholes that we can go down and